Now, from CBS News Miami, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Welcome to Facing South Florida. I'm Lauren Pastrana in for Jim DeFede. It's a new year and a new legislative session is just around the corner. When Florida lawmakers convene in March, they'll tackle a host of issues, and many are hoping property insurance reform is high on the agenda. Jeff Brandes is a former state senator who served in Tallahassee from 2010 to 2022. He's now the founder and president of Florida Policy Project, a resource for policy leaders who want to make a positive impact in Florida. We spoke about the future of property insurance in Florida and his legislative wish list for 2025. Senator Brandes, thanks so much for being with us today. Now, it's a new year, but many Floridians are still picking up the pieces from just a catastrophic hurricane season last year. Even though, thankfully, South Florida did not take a direct hit, we can expect to be directly impacted by potential increases in our property insurance. So many people will be watching and waiting to see if the legislature tackles the topic in the upcoming session. So what, if any, changes can we expect this year?
Well, I think on a rate basis, I think you'll see a stabilization of rates. I don't think you're going to see rates go down dramatically, but I don't think you're going to see them go up dramatically either. These storms, while severe for those that were impacted, Helene was mostly a water event, and so that will affect the National Flood Insurance Program and not really addressing the major insurers of Florida. Milton, on the other hand, was a major event for Florida, and so I think it will firm up rates, but I don't think you'll see them radically increase.
Okay, so not radically increasing, certainly a good thing, but a lot of people have been dealing with, extra costs at the grocery store. Everything seems to be more expensive. So they're hoping for at least, a little bit of relief somewhere, maybe in property insurance. Why not? Why is it such a tricky issue to try and bring that back down here in Florida?
Well, just like milk and eggs have gone up, the pricing for materials for properties has gone up as well, as well as labor costs. So, insurers are dealing with inflation just as well as everybody else is dealing with it, and the cost of rebuilding properties has gone up as well. So I think that's where I think the rate stabilization piece comes into play. I think if the legislature focuses on anything this year, what they should focus on is Citizens property insurance. Citizens has almost $500 billion of risk on their books, and yet less than $10 billion in cash. So it's that's an area where I think the legislature should focus on. Will it? I don't know. But I think if I was going to advise the legislature to focus on one area of property insurance, it would be on reducing the size of the liability of Citizens property insurance.
All right, we're going to get to Citizens in just a moment, but it's been a few years since there's been major action on insurance reform here in Florida. And the goal of the previous action actually brought new companies into Florida, perhaps relieving a little bit of that strain on Citizens. How has that helped? Can we expect to see more companies coming in and writing policies here in Florida again?
I think you will. Look, many of the companies that have joined in Florida are actually existing companies that started new companies. While that's a benefit to everybody, what you really need is new capital. And I think you're still kind of in the early phases of seeing new capital deployed in Florida. We've had a handful of companies that were truly new companies start in Florida. But it would be the most encouraging thing that we could see is to see more market entrance into Florida. It's what the market needs, and that's ultimately what's going to drive the pricing pressure to bring rates down. Understand 40 cents of every insurance dollar is actually sent offshore to reinsurers. This is to Bermuda and to London to cover the reinsurance cost of essentially of major catastrophic events. What we've seen, though, is some softening in pricing amongst reinsurers, which we think is incredibly positive. The reinsurers did really well last year. That hopefully will translate to lower prices or at least stabilization in prices amongst reinsurance.
Let's go back to Citizens here. So first things first, for people who might not understand it, whenever we mention Citizens, we say, insurer of last resort. And many of us, myself included, at one point were dropped from our regular property insurance carriers and basically forced into Citizens. And then within the last year, I got that letter from Citizens saying, hey, we found someone else who will insure you for a higher premium, but we're going to, pass you off there. So there's been a lot of back and forth with a lot of people, and people might just genuinely be confused. What does this mean for them? Is there anything that they can do if Citizens is passing them around and just, drops them into another company? Should people just be shopping around at this point? Is that an option for people?
Absolutely, they should be shopping around. They should be looking at price, but also terms of their policies. Citizens policy is a pretty bare bones policy, and oftentimes they can find a better policy at a competitive price to Citizens. But Citizens is now required to transition individuals. If an insurance company comes to Citizens and says, we're willing to take that policy at Citizens rates or up to 20% above Citizens rates, those policies are no longer eligible for Citizens and must be transitioned out. That was part of a law passed 2 or 3 years ago. So we're seeing that become into full effect now, and we've seen a lot of takeouts out of Citizens. And I think overall, that's very positive. Citizens really, if you look at the health of the Florida marketplace, what you really want to look at is Citizens growing or shrinking? And right now we're seeing Citizens begin to shrink, which I think is an incredibly positive sign for the overall marketplace. Citizens can't be sitting on 1.3 million policies and $500 billion in risk. That is just something that could potentially bankrupt the state of Florida and frankly, the taxpayers of the state, because we're the ones who ultimately back Citizens.
Okay, so that brings me to House Bill, I believe, 13, sponsored by State Representative Hillary Castle here of Broward County, to make Citizens available to all property owners in Florida, but to only cover windstorm damage. To begin, how would that actually work? What are the chances of a bill like that passing? It seems like similar ideas in the past have not gone anywhere, and it seems like that would grow the footprint of Citizens in Florida, would it not?
It would radically expand the footprint of Citizens in Florida. It's not an idea that I would support. I don't think Citizens supports. I don't think the governor would support that idea. Listen, we can't be, we can't be everything to everyone. And unfortunately, that would expand Citizens' exposure from $500 billion to well over $1 trillion. That would be something I don't think that the market could support. I don't think Citizens could support it. And at some juncture, you're writing checks that the state just simply can't cash. And so I think we need to let the private market work. It can work. It is going to be working better than it currently is. We're seeing the market that's getting healthy. Imagine this is a patient that went through extreme surgery 2 years ago, and it's now kind of getting on its feet, and it's starting to walk again. That's where the Florida property insurance market is. The best thing we can do is focus on the major issues at Citizens Property Insurance. There are some minor tweaks I think we can do in the property insurance world to make it better for customers and consumers. I think we should focus on those issues, but I don't think we need to take it back and put it in surgery again.
Interesting comparison there, because I'm sure some people might say it's been a long and painful rehab of the Florida property insurance market here in the state. So hopefully, though, they are getting closer and closer to that recovery. Incoming State House Speaker Daniel Perez has said, quote, "I don't want to lose the next generation of talent to another state because the affordability in Florida has gotten too high." So we're talking property insurance, just regular housing costs, all the different implications beyond just the current homeowners. This could influence whether young professionals actually choose to set down roots here in Florida or move elsewhere. How big of an issue could that be down the road to, the health and well-being and prosperity of the future of Florida?
I think overall affordability is the #1 issue in the state of Florida right now. And I think the challenge that the legislature has is they don't have a real housing plan. They don't have a statewide housing plan to address, actually adding more housing supply at scale. We've heard about Live Local. Live Local is a small piece of the overall puzzle, but it's like having one piece of the puzzle and not knowing what the other pieces even are, or even what the picture that you actually want to generate looks like. This is where Florida is. The Florida Policy Project, a nonprofit that I'm involved with, has put forth best practices for the legislature to consider. Things like smaller lot sizes, allowing for accessory dwelling units, getting rid of parking minimums, allowing for upzoning. Those are the things that will actually drive housing supply. And while insurance is always going to be a component of overall affordability, frankly, right now, what we're dealing with is a supply problem when we have incredible amount of demand coming to Florida. People want to live in this great state, but we have a reduction in supply of housing. We're just simply not building enough, and frankly, not building enough of what people need, which isn't $1 million homes. It's that $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 home, or frankly, that $200,000 accessory dwelling unit that allows people to get in for $2,000 a month.
You mentioned the Florida Policy Project. It has a mission of positively influencing the quality of life for Florida residents and guests. So we want to know, what do you consider the biggest issues, the non-negotiables that need to be addressed during this upcoming session to make life better for everyone here in Florida?
The #1 thing we can do is focus on housing. I think housing has become the critical issue of the state of Florida, and mostly on the affordability side of that. Again, those big ideas, those best practices in housing, which requires Florida to come up with a housing policy, really a set of ideas that we can build a strategy towards. Right now, I don't think that exists. In transportation, I think that our proposal is that Florida become the leader in the country in timing its signals the right way. Everybody has kind of come up to a stoplight and found that, you know what, there's nobody else here. Why is this light still red? Florida is really not considered a leader in traffic signalization. It's an area that I think we can continue to focus on. On property insurance, I think there's a number of things we can be doing, but frankly, we should be focusing on citizens property insurance, reducing the size and scope and the liability of citizens property insurance. There are a variety of other challenges that Florida faces. One that's often not talked about is our prison system. And I think that's an area where the legislature should spend a lot of time. The KPMG, a global consulting firm, did a study on the Florida prison system just a year ago and said we need to spend $12 billion over the next 20 years on the prison system.
Wow, certainly things that we will be watching over the course of the next session and well beyond here at CBS Miami. Senator Brandes, thank you so much for your time and your insight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Up next, a look at a new state law that could have kids logging off social media, what parents and a psychiatrist are saying about it. A Florida law aimed at getting kids off social media is technically now in effect, but it's not yet enforceable as it's being challenged in the courts. CBS News Miami's Yvonne Taylor explains the law, why it's being challenged, and what parents think about it.
Alex Goldsmith is very vocal about a state law that prevents teenagers from having or opening social media accounts.
I don't agree with that. I think everyone should be able to have social media.
This 16-year-old tells me teenagers not only use social media to explore the unknown, which is some parents' biggest fear and the premise of the law.
But some people use social media to like communicate with their friends and stuff. So I think it's nice to have.
His dad supported him wholeheartedly.
I agree with everything he said. He's very responsible. We're not worried about him on social media.
The social media restrictions were part of Florida House Bill 3, signed into law by Governor Ron DeSantis in March of 2024. It requires platforms like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, among others, to terminate certain accounts and provide additional options for termination of such accounts.
Of course, absolutely.
Albany Guerra, mother of a teenager, sees the new law as a ray of light.
She's against it, but like all teenagers, they find a way.
She encourages ongoing supervision, especially because social media companies may not immediately kick teenagers off their platforms. In fact, the state will not legally enforce the law until at least February, because there are 2 lawsuits challenging the constitutionality of the restrictions.
I'm 17, and I get how parents, adults would get that 14-year-olds don't have to be on social media.
Angel and his sister Damaris agree with the change.
Because more exposure to social media can increase their mental explorations of bad things.
Neil Goldsmith says it's about supervision. He told me if Alex was 15, he would not restrict him from social media.
He's got my permission. He's got his mom's permission.
So if the law becomes enforceable, social media companies could actually be subject to penalties if they don't restrict teenagers from their sites. And that could include a $50,000 penalty per violation. We're in Doral. Yvonne Taylor, CBS News, Miami.
Parents and lawmakers have had their say, but what's the science behind these age restrictions? We spoke to Dr. Daniel Bober, a psychiatrist specializing in mental illness and addiction with Memorial Health System, for a deeper dive. Dr. Bober, thanks so much for joining us. Now, we just heard from parents about their stance on social media for their kids. Some say they're comfortable with it. It's okay. Others, though, do have their reservations. I find it depends a lot on the age of their children. So let's break it down, beginning with that age threshold. The law bans kids under 14 from having social media accounts, and kids 14 or 15 will need parental consent. So what's the science behind those ages? Is there a science? As an expert, what is too young for kids to be on social media?
Well, we generally recommend that kids 2 years or younger have no screen time whatsoever. We know, for example, that kids should not have more than an hour of screen time. And we know that after an hour of screen time, the risk of mental illness increases. And then finally, at the 3-hour mark, the risk of mental illness more than doubles. This is a tricky topic because social media in and of itself is not all bad. there are definitely some things about social media that can foster positive relationships in kids. But what we do know is that in children, the amount of screen time, the frequency, and the number of platforms increases with mental illness. There is definitely an association between those three things. And we know that social media can increase the risk of depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, problems with body image, increased eating disordered behavior, and social anxiety. So again, while there's not a cause and effect relationship, it does seem to be the fuel on the fire.
You mentioned those screen time limits, obviously starting as young as 2 years old, or from newborns to 2 years old, no screens at all is really what's recommended. But, you know, in this day and age, we see a lot of, you know, toddlers and you know, younger kids with those iPads. They're not on social media, but yeah, they are seeing things on screens. So how is that potentially negatively impacting them? What are some of the, you know, mental health issues just from simply being on a screen all day that you're seeing in children?
Well, it really depends on the content, right? So some of the educational content can actually be beneficial. But look at what's happened the last 20 years, right? We see double the rates of obesity, kids on social media, on screens that are much more sedentary, and you combine that with a poor diet, and the rate of obesity in children and adolescents is almost 20%. An increased risk of suicide from 2007 on, the risk of suicide increased 62%. So there are some real public health implications to being on the screen, but it does depend, again, what content is being viewed on these screens.
Let's say kids are on social media. Let's say their parents set them up, you know, with an Instagram or a Facebook account, TikTok, what have you. And there are comments out there. Kids are seeing these things. Is that really the main issue, that kids are being, you know, their eyes are being opened up to potentially negative comments, and that could hurt their self-esteem? And that's where we're seeing these suicide rates increasing by leaps and bounds over the last decade?
Well, I definitely think social media is part of the problem. But, you know, I have a little bit of a skewed perception because I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. So I always see the worst outcomes. I have kids in my office that are on social media where some of the platforms are teaching them how to self-harm or cut themselves or burn themselves, or talking about the most efficient way to commit suicide. So I'm seeing the worst outcomes. But yes, I do agree that some of these social media platforms are highly reinforcing. And we know that the development of the brain, particularly around the time of 10 to 19 years of age, is a particularly sensitive time for emotional regulation, for impulse control, for learning, and other types of behavior. And we know that children and adolescents have a brain that seeks out novel experiences, that has difficulty weighing the future consequences of its actions, and fails to control its impulses. So in a way, this is really the perfect storm for their stage in brain development.
As parents, of course, we want to know, what can we be doing? How can we help our kids navigate this you know, new world that we didn't have to deal with as kids? I couldn't get on social media as a child because it didn't exist in the capacity that it does now. So what are some of the warning signs that parents should be looking out for?
So obviously, limiting screen time, trying to keep these devices out of the bedroom at night, particularly when they're supposed to be sleeping, keeping it away from the dinner table, trying to delay the use of social media and smartphones as long as possible. That is, I think, a key point to all this.
And doctor, I have a question. I mean, as my phone is right next to me right now, is part of the problem also that our kids see us on our own devices? So we kind of have to, as adults, take a stand as well and maybe spend less screen time, less time on social media, and be the example that these kids need?
Yes, absolutely. Children model their parents' behavior. And so if you as a parent are always on your phone, if you're at the dinner table or in family events where you're supposed to be present and you're always on your phone, that sets a very poor example for kids. And I do think that these phones and these social media platforms have behavioral algorithms that are highly reinforcing. And we see addiction or addictive-like behaviors from the phones, and particularly when the phones or the social media platforms are withdrawn from people, they have increasing episodes of anxiety. So there is an addictive or an addiction-like component to it.
So getting to this law here in the state of Florida, based on what you've been telling me and explaining, it sounds like you are, in fact, perhaps in favor of some sort of legislation that sort of polices the use of social media and even screen time for kids 14 and under. Do you think that that's a good thing that needs to be going into effect this year?
You know, a lot of critics will say that it violates free speech. A lot of critics will say it's not a good idea, but I will tell you this. Over 2/3 of parents are not using parental controls on these devices. So they're not doing the job. So we need something from a public health perspective to try to control what's happening. And so I do agree that this bill is a good idea. I think it's going to take us in a positive direction. Obviously, kids who are 14 or 15 can use social media with parental consent. But I do think kids, particularly at a young age, and particularly younger girls, are particularly vulnerable to the effects of social media. So I do think that this is a net positive.
Yeah, not just about parental consent, needs that parental oversight as well. Right now, though, there's some legal challenges to the law, but let's say it becomes enforceable after the challenges and kids are banned from social media. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but could there be negative ramifications for that? Because for some kids, social media provides some much needed connection. So could losing that connection also be a problem for them?
You know what, Lauren? What did we do before social media? Somehow we found a way to be connected. And what has social media done for us? Social media began in the late 90s. And again, during that period of time, we had massive increases in obesity. We had massive increases in suicide rates. So I'm not suggesting that that's the fault of social media, but I'm saying that maybe we as a society need to find a way to be connected without the use of social media. And I do think that there are, again, some positive things to say about social media. There are some benefits in terms of the connections that young people will make. But what I see is a lot of damage. And so I think this is a good first start. We can try it and see how it goes, and we can always change course if we need to.
In the meantime, though, what conversation should parents be having with their kids about responsible use of technology and social media? What can they say? Do you give these parents advice?
I would say that they could talk to them about some of the research that's been out there that shows that increased screen time definitely can have a negative effect on their mental health, and that we as parents are just trying to help you make healthy choices. And we're here. It's important to keep an open line of communication. And I think that is really one of the most challenging things I see as a child psychiatrist is a lot of parents don't have an open line of communication with their kids. They're not communicating with them. They're not explaining why they're doing things. And I think if you can have that connection with your child and be present, I think that's essential.
Yeah, and I find giving an alternative helps too. If my son wants to play his video games, I'm like, hey, wait, let's do something else. Let's, do a puzzle. Let's go outside. Let's read a book. Give him something else to do so he can't say, but I'm bored. So that certainly does help as well.
Go outside, throw a football, spend time with them. Because again, then they're getting the exercise and then they're getting off the grid, and that's a double positive right there.
Absolutely. Dr. Bober, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
We'll be right back with a final look at other new laws that just took effect this week. Welcome back. Here's a roundup of some of the other new laws now in effect here in Florida. That same social media law we just discussed includes another component that requires adult sites to use age verification services. A controversial law now in effect makes it illegal to stay within 25 feet of a first responder who has verbally warned someone to back off while the first responder is performing a legal duty. Critics argue this gives first responders greater power to move citizens away who may be recording any wrongdoing. Senate Bill 556 is aimed at protecting the vulnerable population. It says that any financial institutions that believe someone is being taken advantage of by a guardian or someone with power of attorney can put a hold on a transaction for 15 business days and begin an investigation. And House Bill 267 modifies the Florida Building Code so that drawings bearing the seal of a design professional are no longer needed to replace windows, doors, or garage doors in existing homes as long as they match the previous installations. That's less paperwork for you and likely a faster permitting process. That's all the time we have. Jim will be back next week. Thank you again for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.